Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices webcast, and this time we're going to talk about localization with SharePoint Framework client-side web parts. My name is Vesa Juvonen, I'm a Senior Program Manager from the SharePoint engineering teams, and with me today, a person responsible of the demo will be Waldek Mastergaard. So Waldek, will you do the intros as well?
Sure. Hi everybody, my name is Waldek Mastergaard. I am developer at Anchor. I'm also Office Development MVP, and today we will talk about localizing SharePoint Framework client-side web parts.
Yeah, indeed. This is an interesting topic because the reality is, if you think about the realities of SharePoint reach across the world, there's multiple countries where SharePoint is used. I don't know the exact number, but obviously there's multiple languages what people are actually using in SharePoint Online or in on-premises. So with the client-side web parts, we absolutely need to be able to localize the labels and the content of those web parts. So this is kind of a preview session though, because we are showing stuff in the level of Drop 6, so not quite in the release candidate level, not quite in the GA level of the client-side web parts. But we'll make sure that we have all of this information also as a tutorial within the dev.office.com/SharePoint in the future, and keeping all of that up to date. Before we go to the actual content and the demo itself, where we see how to make this happen with the client-side web parts, let me quickly just explain what the SharePoint Patterns and Practices is all about. So SharePoint Patterns and Practices is owned by the SharePoint engineering. So we in the Redmond are actually coordinating this effort, but we work together with community. And we work together with community so that we can collect the feedback from a community and work together with the community to solve issues in an open source manner. The SharePoint Patterns and Practices is providing code samples, guidance documentation in MSDN. We have monthly community calls, bi-week special interest group calls. We have case studies. The concentration is on the SharePoint Framework, obviously, which is going to go GA relatively soon when this video is recorded. And it might have been GA'd already when you're watching the video. And obviously, we'll also concentrate on the SharePoint adding model and Office 365 APIs and Microsoft Graph in general. AKMS SharePoint PnP is the URL to remember. Now, let's jump back on the content, and we can actually start with the UI. So let's talk about the translation of the client-side web part. I mean, kind of use this super simplistic web part as the reference. So we want to make sure that we concentrate on the functionality and the scenario rather than, let's say, having a flashy web part. We will have plenty of flashy web parts in the future as well, but for showing the scenario, I think the simplicity is the key. So let's talk about this one with Waldek as well. So first topic, what we need to translate, obviously, is the web part body. So that's something in this particular case for the web part, which is translated or typically should be translated based on the language of the site. And it's kind of a label. It's a static string which we have inside of the web part. You don't control that in this case because we're not exposing that as a property from a property pane, as you can see in this particular case. So based on the site setting, the site language, and the user language preferences, if the language, for example, let's say Spanish or Swedish or Finnish is enabled on a site and somebody has that as the preferred language within their user profile settings, we should be able to translate that to the right language. Right, Waldek?
Yes.
Really,
and I guess that.
Yeah, sorry.
Yep. Yeah, I guess that if you look at the Workbench, there's one thing that gives away that actually the Workbench that you see now on the screen works in Dutch. So if you look at toolbar where you see save, discard, mobile, tablet, preview, the mobile label is actually in Dutch. Because the Workbench that you see, I ran that in the context of a site that uses Dutch as a language. So based on that, you can see that the Workbench itself is shown in Dutch, but because we didn't include the text, or we included the text only in English, you see it in English, right? So that will be definitely a thing that you want to switch the languages to as the language of the site or the user is being switched as well.
That's a good point. And looking into actually on the web part picker as well, we can see that some of the out-of-the-box web parts, like the picture web part, that actually has implemented the localization properly, because we're seeing that web part name using a Dutch translation. But for some of the web parts like Yammerfeed, it's Yammerfeed. It hasn't been actually translated, or Office 365 video as well. And in this case, we're playing around with creating a web part that has not been translated in the manifest of the web part. So the title of the web part is still creating in this particular case. So which is actually running us to the second case, which is really around how do we translate then the titles of the web part. So what does the end user see in the web part picker when they're adding the web part in to the site itself? And like mentioned, in this case, the creating web part is not translated. The title is creating regardless of the language settings. And like we can see for some of the out-of-the-box web parts, but some of the out-of-the-box web parts are translated accordingly. So they are slightly further down on the development cycle from that perspective. Good. Then from a translation perspective, whenever you are configuring the web part, then we have few considerations here as well. So we have the property pane labels. So these are the actual labels of the properties which people are able to add on the configure on the particular web part. And if you want, you can absolutely translate these, and typically that would be the right thing to do, because if you're translating the static labels and the title of the web part, you should be translating these as well. Now, if it's an enterprise development scenario, it might be actually architectural decision that we assume that the people who are configuring web parts they all understand English. So therefore, let's keep the language in English, which will most likely reduce, let's say, training costs, because everything will be consistent. But again, if you are using a reusable or creating a reusable web part, which is used across maybe multiple companies even, then probably you want to actually have the translations for the property pane labels in place as well. And then the final kind of a thing is then the actual property values and potential content. So this is then this is kind of an additional dimension on this discussion. Sure, we can translate the labels of and the title of the web part, but what about content? So what about the scenarios where the same web part is put on the front page of the intranet or collaboration site, and this front page is being accessed in multiple different languages? So how do I make sure that my content of the web part is being translated as well? And that's where we need to do some additional tricks. So in this case, as an example, in this example scenario, we are showing 3 different localizations, so or translations in a simplistic way. So we have the ENUS, DEDE, so German, and NL, which is Dutch in this case, or Netherlandish. No, just kidding. Netherlandish. Oh, that's a good language. Right? So, but anyway, the whole point being on the fact that what values we are doing here, and this is a completely web part specific implementation. So in this particular web part, that scenario where the content is being dynamically translated is being considered, and the web part itself is actually implementing this kind of a way of providing that option to define the content in 3 different languages.
So there are two things that I wanted to ask you about. So one, isn't it like that when you create a site, you choose a language, and that's the language that's being always used by the site? And then 2, why these 3 languages and not more? Because SharePoint online is available in 20 or more. So why these 3? Do we have to do that per web part, or how do we choose which languages we pick there?
Good question. So when you're creating a site in SharePoint, and that applies for on-premises as well, you can select the language of the site. And yes, that actually defines some of the default settings of the site. So the default language of the site will be that particular language. Now, if you have enabled additional languages on the site, and by default in SharePoint Online, we actually enable all of the 25 languages on the site, that means that the site has readiness to translate the labels, for example, the site setting text or the site contents text or the recent in a navigation text to those 25 languages. And then when a user accesses the site, if the user has set a preferred language to be something else, then the default language of the site, and that something else is enabled on the site as a language, then we translate that site or those labels based on the end user language. And I do understand that that's a relatively complex way of putting that, unless you can actually Waldek explain that in a more suitable way.
Well,
but it is a relatively complex thing.
Well, so to rephrase and check if I get the thing correctly, what you can do is that out of the box, all of the languages that Microsoft used to build SharePoint Online are enabled in Office 365, right?
Correct. On every single Office 365 site, unless you do any other changes.
Yes. And then you can, when you create a site, let's say you create a site in English, you can still go to the site and enable one of the other 24 languages available and say, okay, so the users in my company can also speak in Finnish. Finnish is not an official language.
That's not an official language, yes.
Yeah, so in Finnish or in Dutch, and then whenever the user chose that language as preferred language, when they come to the site, SharePoint will switch by itself to that language, correct?
Absolutely correct. And obviously we want to have that same, because out-of-the-box web parts are doing that by default. When you're implementing a custom web part, you want to do the same thing as well. So you want to flip the labels and texts, and like the titles of the web parts, so what we're seeing in the web part picker, to the same language what the user prefers to actually see within the site.
Yeah, you basically want the web parts that you build to blend in with everything else on the page.
Correct.
To follow the same UI.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, the follow-up question what you actually had was that, okay, that takes care of the labels, that takes care of, in quotes, the static texts within the web part. What about this content? Why do we have those three here? Well, this is a kind of a debatable approach. So in our case, we wanted to demonstrate also the scenario which quite often people might run into. We translate in the SharePoint static labels. So out-of-the-box web parts do translate static labels as well based on the end user selected or preferred language. But we don't actually translate content. If the content would need to be translated, you would need to implement something custom or something additional thing. And what I mean with that one is that the content is content. If we say, as an example, that hello text box, what we can see underneath the ENUS, that is not by default translated because it's content. In this case, what we've done is that in this particular web part, this completely custom implementation where it's exposing as an example 3 different localizations, the English, the German and Dutch, and then you can actually fill what would be the text if the end user language would be matching to that locale. We could just as well add those 25s here, but that from a simplicity perspective, we wanted to have a simplistic demo which is showing how to make this happen. Maybe in a real-world implementation, you would have some sort of a pop-up which you can open up from this property pane, where you have a grid where you can more easily actually define the languages and the translations for different languages for the content as well. Or
so,
you might choose, or you might choose that, I'm not going to actually translate. My configuration entry is same for all of the languages, which good example would be images. Most likely you will show the same image regardless of the language what the end user is using. So
the thing that I wanted to ask is whether when you build the web part, do you have to know the languages up front, or is there a way in which you can get the list of languages enabled on a site and then include that in the UX?
Well, you can in this particular implementation, and like this kind of a simplistic scenario, we are actually dynamically adding those properties on the web part. So what we're doing is that we're accessing the list of languages enabled on the site, or we could actually do that, and then expose those as an option within the web part site.
All right, cool. So I guess that with that, it's time for us to show the way it works.
Exactly. I think it's a bit easier to understand all of these 4 options when we are seeing all of this live within the demo. So let's actually do that, and let's flip on Waldex's desktop and have a look on how things are actually working in practice and how they're implemented.
All right. So with that, let's have a look how you can translate web parts to multiple languages. So first, let's add the web part that we've built, the sample that we have, to the page. And as you can see here, the workbench that we have runs within the context of a site created in Dutch, which is why all of the labels are in Dutch. And if I add the web part to the page here, you can see it. If I open its pane, we will see the labels here in English, which in a way is odd, but we will get back to that. And here we see the ability to provide the greeting in all of the languages enabled on this site. So the context site that we use here is created in English and has Dutch and German enabled as additional languages that users can use. So here we can type hello in English, hallo in German, and hoi in Dutch. And now you can see that because this site is in Dutch, the text in Dutch is actually being shown within the web part. If we switch to a workbench in a site that's created in English, so that's the one here, if we open a toolbox, we can now see that all of the labels are in English. And if we once again add the web part to the page and provide the greetings here, you can see now that because this site has been created in English and none of the languages is added, we only have one option to enter the greeting in English, and whatever we type here is directly shown within the web part.
Makes sense.
So with that, let's have a look at how this works and what the different options are to actually translate the web part to multiple languages. So the first thing that you can do is you can translate the manifest. The manifest is the part where the metadata about the web part is included, and some of the things that you type in here within the manifest show actually inside a toolbox. So, for example, things like title, description, and icon show up back here. If you choose to add the web part, you will see it here, right? And here, there are some of the values included within the manifest are of type iLocalized string, which allows you to provide not only one value, but actually multiple of them, where each one corresponds to a language you support. So as in here, we have default one. So imagine that our web part would be added to a Finnish site, which we don't support, so we always have the fallback, and that's prerequisite. Whenever you enter the value for a iLocalized string property, you always have to include the default. And then on top of that, you can add more strings for, like here in Dutch, German, Finnish, Spanish, anything else, right? So that's the way it works. And the only thing is that currently when we record this, the workbench doesn't show the strings. So no matter which language you choose and what is the language of the site you would use, it will always show up in English. It will always pick default string. And often this is in English, but you could choose to have default in Spanish or French, whatever you like, right? Whatever is the most common language used within your company.
Yeah. And one thing to call out that the version what we're right now using within the recording is the dropped 6. So this is time before the release candidate and GA.
Yes. Yes, and I guess that it is reasonable to expect that at some point in time we'll be able to actually see different strings within the Workbench toolbox when you work with sites that actually offer this support, right? So
yes.
If you would have translation for Dutch and you would be in the Workbench run within the context of a site in Dutch, that you would actually be able to see the labels in Dutch so that during development you can already test whether everything fits on a screen and works as expected.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
But currently it always picks one string, right? So that's the one thing. You can include additional languages for a few of the labels, which are group, title, description within the manifest. So that's the one thing that you can provide multiple values for. Another thing that you can translate are actually properties within property pane. So these strings like here, like header, section, and name of the fields. And this is done in another way. So if we go, you go to the code here. Here is the method called getPropertyPane settings, and this name again comes from the build drop 6 that we have, which is quite old one. And it could be that this name changed in RC or the version that will be available in GA.
Yeah.
But either way,
basics are exactly the same, but there are some type differences, but still, yeah.
Exactly. So here you can see that we have two labels that we actually point to, right? So there is one string here and another here. And the interesting part here is that we actually include the pointer to the string, but not string itself. So the text that you see here on the screen, greeting to show in the web part, is not the text that we include here actually. So here we point to a resource file that we have here in our logs folder, which is defined here in the mystring.d.ts. So here we have greeting group name, property pane description, and then for English and for Dutch, we actually include these strings that we actually show in the screen. And based on the language of the site, Framework will by itself load the right language by itself, right? So you don't have to do anything other than specify the files, and they are named after the locale lowercase. So we have ENUS, and now you could have DEDE, you could have ESES in Spain, right? So you can create as many of them as you will, as you need, and also based on what's supported in Office, right? And an additional thing is that you can actually see how it works in Workbench. So here, the interesting thing is that even though I start the Workbench within the context of a site created in Dutch, actually the labels that I see here are in English. And the reason for that is that Workbench for the labels doesn't really adhere to the context of the site. Well, in a way it does, but not for this part. For this part, it will only load the language that you choose to start the Workbench in. And if you don't specify anything, it is ENUS. So that's the language here, and this is exactly why you see this in English. But if you go to the command line, and let me increase the font size for it, and I cannot do it.
That's fine.
No, I can, if I go to settings, font size, and I'm quite sure that we'll be able to do some creative editing afterwards to make all of this go away.
Or maybe not.
Or not.
Leaving that.
Or not. So now what you can do here is you can say, as you would, gulp serve, And because we use the workbench that is available in 365, we will also say no browser. But then we will say something like locale NL and L. So that means that we debug a project and we want to debug it in Dutch. So with that, when we build, what you will see is that you will see the usual build process, right? So nothing will change here, but on the output side, and you actually see on the screen some additional info that I used to test this. But here, if we now reload this page, pay attention to the text here. So now all of this and this will actually be in Dutch. And if I open the property pane, there you go.
There we go.
So with that, you can test the labels that you have included and see whether all of that works correctly. And there's actually a neat trick that you can include, because the Workbench also supports the pseudo locales. And that's a thing that you can use to check whether, so imagine that you would build a web part in English. And if you would translate strings to Dutch or German, there is a chance that the length of the strings will expand a lot, right? Because the languages are just not the same. But if you don't know the English or the Dutch phrase up front when you build the web part, you might not know how much place you have to make available for the string on a page, right? So for example here, the button or strings here or here, it might be hard for you to think about like how much space do you need. So with pseudo locales, what you can do is you can include dummy strings that represent the maximum length of your translations. So with that, let's do another test. And this time we will start the Workbench with the QPS block. And that's additional locale that we have included in projects. And if you look at the way it looks, it's gibberish, yeah. Right? So if you look closely, it is English text because that's what you use. But then there are two things additional. So first of all, and let me just open that side by side with English so that we will be able to compare it. So we will leave the QPS block here, and then we will do the English here, and we will close this one. So you can now see that this is exactly the same text. Greeting web part configuration, which is kind of what says here, but then with some additional text. And then we have some additional text here. So there's a site to which we will include the link in the notes that allows you to enter the English string and then expand its length with additional characters to match the expansion in length that you would get when you would translate the text from English to German or Dutch. So that's a nice trick that you can test, that you can use to test that you have enough room on a screen to accommodate these longer strings. And then another thing that you can test in here is use of the characters, right? Because all of these are non-standard ASCII characters. So imagine that you would use a non-standard font within the web part. With this, you can see that you can verify that the font that you use will support correctly the non-standard ASCII characters as well. So if we go back to command line and if we start the QPS block character set, and project will build again. And once that's done, we will be able to refresh the web part and actually see. So now it should be available now. Let me go back to web part, to the Workbench, refresh the page, and now we can see all of the gibberish strings here, and we can actually verify that all of them fit on a screen. Well, almost all of them, because here, and that's exactly why you include bracket and exclamation mark, you can see that this string is actually being cut. So it fits here, but we don't see its end. So this one here reps, but this one does not. Right? So with that, you can see that there is potentially not enough room on the screen to accommodate it. And that might be an issue within the control, within CSS. So that might indicate something that you might need to investigate closer. But here, for example, the button, you can see that expands accordingly. So with that, you should be okay for including additional strings. Right? And actually, the same approach you can use within the body. Right? So here you've seen that we include the labels in property pane. And you can also see that we use exactly the same approach here in the button. So here, if we go back to the project, and let me open this one and close these two guys, we can go back to our component greeting when we actually show that. Once again, we embed exactly the same text from strings, which we import here in the class. We refer to one of the strings that we have defined here. And then on the runtime, we load it either in English, Dutch, QPS block, or some other locale that we have. And actually, if you think about it, the essential part is that the keys in all these files are actually in sync, right? So if you have here these three guys, you should have exactly the same three keys in all of these files as well, right? So here, in one of them, I had 4. So here I have default, I have 4. I have one which is old, which I don't use anymore. But it proves point that at this point you have to keep them in sync, because if you would add one here, let's add another one. Let's add one called test, and that would be a string, but you don't have it here in English. On runtime, you would have a missing string, right? So you would have a gap on a screen. Right, so you definitely don't want to do that. So you have to ensure that all of these are in sync. That all of the keys defined here are also included here and here in all these files. And then the final part is actually how we deal with MUI. So MUI is the ability that you have to offer additional languages in your SharePoint site. So as I said, this site is created originally in English, but I added 2 languages, German and Dutch, which you can see here. So let me open this site in another tab, and I will go directly to Layout Settings to speed things up. And I guess that even for this, we can do some creative editing for this.
Yeah.
not to be that long.
Cut the waiting time. Yeah, that's fine. Or we don't, because every now and then things do take a while. So.
Yes. And it's 3, 2, 1. Well, so actually, the title is there. The rest of the screen is blank. I have no idea why. Let me reload it. Because these are the things that you get when you show these things, right?
Yeah, exactly. You might run into these things by yourself as well. So.
Yes, there you go.
Much better.
Yeah. And now you see all of the site in Dutch, because I said that for me preferred language is Dutch, which is why you see all of that. But here you can go to languages. And in a second, let me open another tab and show you this interface in English. So we will go to Department, which is on our site, Settings, ASPX, and we'll open this one. And here you can see that the default language is English, which is the one that I used to create the site. And also I added here German and Dutch. Yeah. If I would go to another site that I have here to language under site, you will see that I only have English enabled, and I didn't choose anything else, right? So all of these are available, but blank. I didn't enable them on this site, which means, yep. Go on.
No. Which means that we are falling back on English. Sorry for jumping on that one. But could you actually, while it goes to your user profile as well, and just to show why did we cut the one side in Dutch? And this does take a while. We might actually edit this request away from the that's an admin UI. I'm thinking just your user profile and Delph, if possible, because
well,
that
so
would
actually
be the end user
that does
experience.
not show the language. That does not show the language. So this is exactly why I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's another trick, right? So here now you can see all of that in Dutch because I said that my preferred language is Dutch. So here if I go to Isaiah, and you will need to trust me on this that this look exactly the same for you in English, that it is still there.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult to understand where we are. And this is one of the downsides and debatable things. Should the admin UIs actually be translated at all? Because I understand that the end user content and end user sites should be translated, but admin UIs, well, debatable.
Yeah, but I mean, if you choose as admin that you want to see things in Dutch, then you see things in Dutch, right?
True. Fair point.
Right, so here's exactly the place where you can say whether you want to see things in Dutch or English, right? And I chose to see them in Dutch so that we can see how the language would switch, but you can easily move them to up and down to set the order, the preference of your languages, right? So you will first try to load the site in Dutch. If it's not there, in English. If it's not there, you could add Finnish, Spanish, Esperanto. Esperanto is not.
Yeah, that's not an official language, unfortunately. That was a great idea.
Yeah, Arabic.
Latin.
Yeah. So here we have the options, and that's why all of this work, right? So this is exactly why we see three languages here, because we enable 3 languages on this site, right? So the languages that you see here correspond to languages enabled here. So here we have English, German, Dutch, and here we see English, German, Dutch. So the way
to be fair, just to quickly pinpoint that explicitly, this is completely custom implementation, right?
Yes.
So
you don't get this out of the box.
Out of the box, you get only the one text box per property, and that's content. That's considered content without any translations. So this is completely custom implementation, just to show that you can do that, but it requires some additional work.
Yes, and now let me just flip that back to English because that's difficult to read. So let me just it's like, what does it say?
Yes, indeed.
Right? So here we are back in our site, and the way it works is there are actually a few steps. So when we open the property pane, what we first do is first from the site that we are at, we load the list of all of the languages enabled for this site. And based on that, we render these text boxes here. So in code, this translates to, here we first go to our on-property pane configuration start event, which is event that triggers whenever you open property pane within the web part. And then we say, okay, so we are going to load some things, and actually in this case it is so fast that you actually don't get to see it. But in case it will be slower, you would actually see a spinner that says reload languages now, please wait. Then we get the list of languages enabled in the site, and the way we do that is we do it in REST. So here, let me reload the page because we cache that. We don't want to load that every time. And let me clear this one here. And now when I open property pane, you can see the request that we do here. So here we call to API web select support UI language IDs, and what we get back are the LSIDs for the languages enabled on the site. So that's English, German, Dutch. But actually we don't want to show numbers here, right? So we want to show some text, and here we chose to show the name, but you might actually want to show the full name like English, German, Dutch. So in order to do it, you have to do it by yourself. So we included here a list of all of the locales that is available in SharePoint, and then we can go with that. We can go back and forth between the LSID and the label, and we have to be able to go back and forth because these are the languages available in this site. But if you explore the Workbench, the currently used language is actually expressed as a string here, right? So based on that, we have to be able to go from the label back to the LSID.
Yeah, it's a slightly inconvenient from an API exposure perspective, but still.
Who knows? Will change at some point in time, but currently.
Indeed.
These are the means available to us.
Let's put it this way: we in engineering are aware of this challenge.
Yes, where you are here, so of course you are available.
Precisely.
Right. So then we have the LSIDs, and then for each one of them we create text field that we will actually show here. So here we have for each loop, and then for each one we will get text field that we show here. So we have one for English, German, and Dutch. And what's interesting here is that up front, when we build the web parts, we don't really know whether we have 3 languages, 5, or 10, and which languages these are. So we cannot really, if you would go back to manifest, we cannot say here that want to have property in English or in Dutch or in Arabic, right? Because we could do that, but there will be quite some overhead to try to get the right text for each one of them, right? And also here, if you look at properties, that's also empty, right? Because we don't really want to include all of that up front. What also works is for you just to specify the name of property for the web part to which you want to bind the value. So here on the fly we say greeting, and that will be 10, 31, 43, 33, depending on your language. But basically what we do is we create web part properties on the fly, right? We don't define them up front. We only create them on runtime based on the languages enabled in this site, right? And then as the label that we show, we get the name. So here we show EN, DD, and LNL, and of course you could choose to show the name of a language. Then when we are done, we assign all of that to an array that we then use in our property pane to actually show all of the fields, right? So typically you would include array directly here in line if you have a set of fields that is fixed, but in our case that depends on the languages enabled on this site. So we can only do that afterwards, after we know the list of all of the languages enabled in this site, right? And then we refresh the pane, right? Because now we have all the fields, we actually want them to render themselves within the pane. So we have to refresh the pane because it's been initially opened, it was empty. So once again, let me reload the page, and if you pay close attention and within the video, you will be able to stop, pause, and go frame by frame. So you will be exactly able to see the way it works. If you now pay attention, the pane is empty at first, and then the fields appear on a screen. So 3, 2, 1, open, empty, empty. Yes, there it is. Yep. So that's exactly the time that it takes to get info about the languages, render the fields, or actually build the fields and then render them in a pane. So that's exactly what we do here, and then we clear the loading message that we have, and we re-render the web part. Right, and based on that, we can then include these 3 guys. So here we have the same text in Dutch, German, and English. And based on the language currently used by the user, we can now show the text within the body. And the way we do that is Here we go to render. We pass that to React. And here we retrieve that we get the language from context page, context, culture info, current UI culture name. So this is the string. We get from that LSID. And then we read the value from the array that we have currently within the web part. So here we will have greeting underscore 1043 to get the text in Dutch.
Because
and
those are the dynamic properties for that particular instance which we dynamically created. So yeah.
That's correct. So this is how it works end to end. And with that, if Vesa, you don't have anything else to ask,
I would like to really kind of explicitly point out that this is the translation of the content. Once again, that's a completely custom implementation for this particular web part, and that's kind of a conceptual implementation which we wanted to show from a consideration perspective. The label translations, those are obviously working much more easily because you don't actually need to worry about the dynamic creation of properties and all of that. You just define the string values for the language themselves. But I think that sums up. Let's switch back on the slides and do a quick summary on things and close up the webcast.
All right.
Excellent. So moving back on, just to kind of summarize the things what we mentioned, we talked about a lot about this language translation thing before the demo, and we tried to explain the different options and considerations in the demo as well. But just to summarize the webcast in three kind of main topics, there's kind of two different scenarios to consider. The most typical scenario is localization of static labels, and with that one we mean the web part title, the static strings in the web part, or the property pane entries in the property pane. And then there's the content. The content is an advanced scenario, and we wanted to show that and clearly flag that in this webcast as well, because so that people understand that, hey, wait a minute, okay, content isn't translated by default, and I would have to implement something clever to make that happen as well. You can do that, but it requires additional work. The SharePoint context or the SharePoint context language actually depends on the site settings and the user settings. So there's two elements on the selection of a UI language. The languages have to be first enabled on a site. By default, all of the 25 languages are enabled on the site regardless of the default language of the site. And then the user has to have a preferred language set to whatever in the user profile. You can actually go to the user profile properties and set your preferred language, and that will then actually flip the UI to be translated automatically. And you as a web part developer, you can actually read that value and then start translating your content and information based on that. Now, like you saw on the demo from Waldeck, localization of actual labels is relatively easy. It's just a matter of getting that translation. And to be fair, maybe we oversimplify the message even. From an implementation technical perspective, the label translation is easy. Getting the actual label text translated could be slightly more complex, because at least in translations of Finnish in SharePoint, they're pretty funky. What are the translations? How do you translate a web part? I have no idea what to call a web part in Finnish, as an example. But that's a side discussion. If you need to have this kind of a dynamic handling or the translation of the content, then that's a slightly more complex scenario. And there's multiple options and considerations around that one. The UI implementation has to be dynamic. There's additional things to consider as well. So that's clearly an advanced scenario. And it might be that in your web part case, you don't need to do that. Good example, like mentioned before the demo, is that if you're showing an image, well, image is most likely the same regardless of the UI language. But then if you have a label which should be translated based on the end user language, then you need to actually somehow expose those translation options for your web part. And that could be slightly complicated to implement for time being. But I think that sums up. Anything else on these, Waldeck, what you would like to call out?
Not on these, but I would definitely encourage everybody to give the sample a try. And if there is anything else that you would like to ask or see, give us a ping.
Absolutely.
Ping us.
Absolutely. Ping us, yes, indeed,
Yeah.
indeed. And really, one of the things what I want to call out, and if you watched any of this webcast in the past as well, we clearly, we intentionally want to keep this relatively simple so that you can easily adapt on the core scenario. Like in this case, the sample itself shows only the core scenario around translation. When you're actually implementing your real-world web port, obviously it won't be looking like that, most likely with the blue background and all of that stuff. It will be much more fancier, and it will have awesome functionalities. But then you can combine these learnings and scenarios to your custom implementation to make it translate as well. So we absolutely recommend you to have a look on the samples which are available, and this particular sample obviously will be referenced in the video notes as well. But I think that's it. Thank you, Waldek, for joining, and we'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Thank you.
Bye.